Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to discuss the setup for a nebula hazard. We're going to create a nebula that flies across the screen, providing a hazard for Scarfy to need to jump over. We're going to discuss the variables that we'll need for this nebula, and we're going to use load texture to get a nebula texture in our textures folder. Let's go ahead and get started. Now here's our window, and Scarfy is in the center in the x-coordinate and on the ground in the y-coordinate. Now we're going to draw another texture for the nebula hazard, and this nebula hazard is going to fly in from the side of the screen. So we can actually start off the nebula off the screen, which should be pretty easy because a texture's position is its upper left corner. So if we use the window width for the nebula's x-coordinate, it's going to start just off the screen out of view. Now the nebula can have its own velocity, which we're going to use a velocity in the x direction pointing left. So it's going to be a negative value. So once we create a nebula and load its texture, we're going to create some variables. For one, we need a texture 2D for that nebula texture, and we're going to call load texture just like we did with Scarfy. We also need a rectangle so that we can have a width and height for the nebula, as well as an x and y to determine which nebula from the nebula sprite sheet to select. We need a vector 2 so we can have an x and y coordinate for the nebula's position on the window. And we're also going to need a velocity, which we can use to update the nebula's position every frame. So with a negative value for the velocity in the x direction, we can update the nebula so it flies across the screen, providing Scarfy with a hazard to avoid. So let's jump into our project and start to create our nebula. Now here we are in our project, and I'm going to scroll up to where we're creating the Scarfy texture. We can take a look at what we've done here for Scarfy and do the same thing for the nebula. Let's put our nebula variables just above Scarfy, and we'll give these Scarfy variables a comment, Scarfy variables. Now just above, we'll create a comment for the nebula, and we'll say nebula variables. Now just like with Scarfy, we need to load a texture for the nebula, so this will be a texture 2D. We can call this nebula. Now we need to know which file to load from our textures folder. Here's our project folder, and here's the textures folder. We're going to be using this nebula sprite sheet. Now if we open this sprite sheet in any image software, we'll see that there are quite a bit more sprites in this sprite sheet than in the Scarfy sprite sheet. This is an 8x8 sprite sheet. Now we're not going to use all of these sprites. We're just going to stick to the top row. But we need to realize that the size of a single sprite is the entire sprite sheet divided by 8, both in the x and the y. So this is the sprite sheet that we want to load, and this is the name that it has in the textures folder. We can simply copy this name, including the .png extension. So here in our program, we're going to initialize our nebula texture 2D using the load texture function. And load texture is going to take the path to that sprite sheet, which is going to be textures / the name we copied. So I'm going to Control V to paste this in and get the name of that nebula sprite sheet, including that .png extension. So now we're loading in this texture and we're initializing our texture 2D called nebula. Now just like we did with Scarfy, we need to unload this texture at the very end of our program. So before we forget, let's scroll all the way down, and here we see we're unloading our texture Scarfy. We can also unload the texture nebula. So let's do that. Unload texture, and we're passing in nebula. So now we know we'll unload this properly. Okay, so in summary, we have discussed how to get a texture from a nebula sprite sheet with an 8x8 size, and we called load texture to get that sprite sheet into our project from the textures folder. We use the load texture function to get that sprite sheet into our project, and at the end of our program, we called unload texture to properly unload that texture before closing the program. In the next video, we're going to work on setting up more variables for the nebula and moving it across the screen. I'll see you then.